Okay, so today we need to start talking about literacy. I don't think it's surprising that the field of rhetoric and composition has concerned itself with literacy. Obviously, you can't compose if you can't read and write. However, fairly early on in the field of rhetoric and composition, they expanded the definition of literacy and they started talking about literacies plural. So literacies. What literacies do you have in your life? So for example, you might be able to read and write, but do you have computer literacy? And maybe you have basic computer literacy, but how literate are you with using the internet or databases or something like that? So we expanded the definition of literacy to include anything that requires specialized knowledge that people need to interact with and have in order to get through their life. So, this unit talks about the acquiring of literacy and what barriers might be in your way or not, depending on who you are and what kind of experiences that you're having. And it also introduces the term literacy sponsor. So your literacy sponsor might be as simple as your teacher at school or teachers as you went through school. So if you want to only talk about reading and writing, your elementary school teachers, and then later your English teachers, and then when you got to college, your English professors. But of course, there are multiple literacies, and your sponsors may have predated school. Maybe your own parents were your literacy sponsors at home before you went to, kindergarten, or in some cases preschool. Some parents are starting very young. So when you think about your life and you look back, who were your literacy sponsors? Who enabled you to learn to read or write or become computer literate, like whatever it is? And who were the people that pushed back? Who were the barriers that said, you're not allowed to enter here? So one thing we know in the field of education is that our culture doesn't want girls to interact with what we call the STEM subjects: science, technology, engineering, and math. We actively, even female teachers, this is very sad, but even female teachers do this. They start pushing girls away from science, technology, engineering, and math, and the further along you get, the more pushback you get. So maybe in elementary school you didn't notice a difference, but then the older you got, the more you discover that there are only boys in the class. We have an entire cultural barrier that says women aren't allowed to be good at those things. And yes, we do have women punching through those barriers. They've been punching through the barriers for decades, and more women are pushing into those fields. But if you actually do a study, you'll discover most of them will say, there were barriers to my literacy. I really had to push. I will never forget the story from my high school chemistry teacher, who was in fact a woman. She told us what happened to her in college and how difficult it was for her to enter science as a field. Notice she ended up being a high school teacher instead of a scientific researcher, and her professors gave her B's no matter how well she did, because her professor literally stood there to her face and said, I refuse to give you an A because you are a woman. I refuse. You shouldn't even be here. So, she got actual in her face pushback, a barrier that said, you're not allowed to be here, you're a woman. And when she refused to give up, she was a really strong person. Overall, she was, actually we were kind of scared of her. But anyway, but she was tough enough to make it. And she was tough enough to nurse her husband, who was a Vietnam vet, who was badly injured. So, she was tough, she made it. So when you think about literacy for yourself and for the people around you, did they get over the top of the barrier? Were they tough enough to get over it? Or did it just stop them cold? It doesn't have to be gender-based. We also have racial barriers in this culture. Are you allowed to be here? Or are only white people allowed? And we even have an interesting but disturbing phenomenon in which students who are of Asian descent or who have recently come from Asia meet the bias of, oh, well, you're automatically good at math. Actually, they're just like everyone else. Some of them are good at math and some of them aren't. But there's so much bias that, I had a student tell me in a conference once for her paper, because she wrote her argument about this problem that she was experiencing. She had her teacher took her out in the hall and said, "Excuse you, why did you make a C on my math test? You are Asian. You should have done better." And she was like, "Excuse you? Actually, I'm good at English, not math." So, we have ways where we push people in certain directions, go toward this and grab other people and say, "You're not good enough." So, sex, race, socioeconomic status. Middle class and upper class people definitely have literacy privilege. It is easier for them. Our cultural narrative is rags to riches, anyone can do it. So if you haven't made it, it's your fault. You're just not working hard enough. We have decades and decades of research about this. This is not true. Where you start impacts where you end up. Students who come to college who have parents who have college degrees already have a leg up. First generation college students struggle more. If your parents already have a master's degree, leg up if you go on to grad school. If your parents already have a PhD, or one of them does, again, leg up. The more education your parents have, the further you are likely to get in your own educational process, and if you are the first person through, then it's going to be harder for you, generally speaking. Again, there are always exceptions. I'm sure you can think of an exception, but I'm talking about what the studies found overall. So barriers to literacy, barriers to education, also sponsors. The professor that said, "I don't care. I don't care if you are black and working class and no one in your family has ever been to college before. I'm going to sponsor you. You will make it." And then the student succeeds and goes on to be, the CEO of a Fortune 500 company or whatever. So those are the kinds of things that this unit is going to take on and have you start thinking about, and the readings will give you examples, and then you will get to ponder, what all this means for you, for the people around you, for your whole society, and if you are in fact a teacher, what it means for you teaching your own students.